When most people read the story of Noah and his sons, their attention naturally drifts toward Shem, the line that led to Abraham, or Ham, whose descendants shaped Egypt and Canaan. But nestled quietly in the pages of Genesis is Japheth, the son whose name appears almost as a footnote. At first glance, it seems he leaves little mark, no grants, no epic journey to recount. Yet, if you look closer, you will discover that Japheth's lineage carries a hidden power, a prophetic and historical significance that stretches far beyond his brief mention. Japheth may not have been celebrated in the spotlight of Scripture, but his role is anything but small, in a world often obsessed with fame, power, and recognition. Japheth reminds us that influence is not always loud. Sometimes, the most profound impact comes quietly, behind the scenes, shaping the course of nations and the destiny of civilizations without drawing attention to itself. His line would eventually give rise to nations whose contributions to culture, philosophy, law, and governance have shaped the modern world, from the Greeks, whose philosophy and reasons still influence our thinking today, to the Romans, whose laws and infrastructure form the backbone of societies across continents. Japheth's descendants played a foundational role in preparing the world for the arrival of the gospel. But Japheth's story is not just about historical influence, it is also a story of divine purpose. Noah's blessing over him, recorded in Genesis 9:27, carries a weight far deeper than a simple promise of land or prosperity. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. These words hint at a future where Japheth's descendants would enter into a spiritual covering, joining the covenantal promise in ways that would extend God's message beyond Israel to the Gentile nations. It is a reminder that purpose and destiny are not determined by birth order or human expectations, but by a divine plan that often unfolds over centuries. Today, Japheth's story speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt overlooked or underestimated. It whispers encouragement to those who work faithfully without recognition, to the silent builders, the teachers, the parents, and the everyday servants whose influence ripples through generations. Japheth teaches us that God's timing is perfect, that even the quietest life can carry the weight of history, and that being unseen in the present does not mean being irrelevant in the grand design of things. If you are fascinated by stories of hidden influence and prophetic significance, then stay with us as we explore the life and legacy of Japheth, the son that history almost forgot. In this video, we will uncover how his descendants shaped civilizations, prepared the world for the gospel, and left a prophetic imprint that echoes even to the present day. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the deep dives into the mysteries of Scripture. Your journey into the hidden story of Japheth starts now. Let us discover how a seemingly quiet son became a cornerstone of history and faith. In the quiet aftermath of the flood, as the waters receded and the ark rested upon the mountains, Noah gathered his sons to pronounce blessings that would ripple through generations, shaping the destinies of nations yet unborn. Among these sons, Japheth stood almost in the shadows of Shem and Ham, a figure whose presence seemed understated, almost incidental, yet whose blessing carried a profound weight, a promise that would unfold across continents and centuries. Genesis 9:27 records Noah's words over Japheth. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. At first glance, these words may appear simple, even poetic, but woven into them is a tapestry of meaning that speaks not only to the physical expansion of lands and peoples, but to the spiritual inclusion and destiny of entire nations. The term enlarge in this blessing is not merely about territory or numbers. It encompasses influence, opportunity, and the capacity to shape the course of civilizations in ways that extend far beyond immediate recognition. Japheth, the son who seemed quietly positioned at the edge of Noah's family, was being promised a reach that would touch the spheres of culture, governance, philosophy, and faith. His descendants would become architects of societies, philosophers who framed thought, builders of roads and cities that would facilitate commerce and communication, and legislators whose systems would provide structure and order for generations. This expansion was intentional, designed not only to populate the earth, but to prepare it for the arrival of spiritual truth, a readiness that would culminate centuries later in the message of salvation reaching beyond Israel to the nations. And then there is the mysterious phrase, "He shall dwell in the tents of Shem," a line that bridges the physical and spiritual realms, connecting Japheth's lineage with the covenantal promise carried through Shem's descendants. This dwelling is more than shared territory or temporary refuge. It is symbolic of inclusion, of Gentile nations being invited into the spiritual inheritance originally given to Israel. Japheth's line was to inhabit the spaces of blessing, to move within the protective and guiding influence of Shem's covenant, signaling a divine orchestration where cultural, political, and spiritual preparation converged. It is a vision that stretches forward into the New Testament, where the gospel moves from its roots in Israel into the broader world, encompassing Greeks, Romans, and peoples of every language and nation, fulfilling the subtle promise embedded in Noah's words. The implications of this blessing begin to appear when one traces Japheth's descendants across history. His sons, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meek, and Tus carry names that map onto regions stretching from Europe to Persia to the lands surrounding the Black Sea. And each branch tells a story of migration, settlement, and civilization building. From these lines arose societies that would give birth to philosophy, art, law, and infrastructure, laying the groundwork for systems of thought and governance that would eventually carry the gospel to the farthest reaches of the known world. In essence, Japheth's enlargement was not only demographic but cultural and intellectual, preparing both the soil and the environment for the seeds of faith to take root and flourish. There is a quiet majesty in Japheth's blessing, for it embodies a principle that transcends the immediate and visible. While Shem received the line through which the Messiah would come, Japheth was entrusted with creating the stage, building the roads, constructing the institutions, and cultivating the ideas that would allow Shem's covenant to be experienced globally. His descendants would not merely survive or multiply. They would shape the frameworks through which human beings could understand, engage with, and receive spiritual truth. Philosophy, governance, infrastructure, art, and language, all these elements became vessels through which the divine narrative could travel. And in this, Japheth's blessing finds its profound significance. It was a promise that the world itself would be prepared for the inclusion of all nations into God's plan. The dwelling in the tents of Shem also carries a subtle but powerful message about unity and shared destiny. It is a vision of reconciliation between peoples who are different in heritage but brought together in purpose and faith, anticipating a time when cultural and ethnic boundaries would no longer prevent participation in the promises of God. Through Japheth, the Gentile nations are not outsiders, they are participants, grafted into a spiritual inheritance that transcends lineage and geography. This vision unfolds over millennia, visible in the spread of the gospel, in the cross-cultural communication of ideas, in the merging of civilizations, and in the quiet yet deliberate ways in which influence travels through generations. Reflecting on this, one begins to see that Japheth's story is not one of being overshadowed or forgotten. It is one of strategic placement. deliberate preparation, and purposeful impact. The blessing of enlargement is both a promise and a responsibility, a divine encouragement to cultivate, expand, and influence wisely, ensuring that the foundation laid by each generation serves the unfolding plan of God. Through Japheth, history is instructed not merely by conquest or visibility, but by faithfulness, vision, and the building of structures physical, intellectual, and spiritual that will endure. In the grand narrative of Scripture, Japheth stands as a quiet architect of destiny, a figure whose seeming invisibility belies a legacy that is both monumental and ongoing. His blessing, promising expansion and dwelling within Shem's tents, reveals a profound orchestration where human history and divine purpose intersect, where the preparation of civilizations meets the unfolding of spiritual truth, and where the hidden work of one Son becomes the stage for the inclusion of all nations into the covenant of God. It is a story that reminds us that influence is not always seen, impact is not always immediate, and legacy is often cultivated in ways that the world cannot yet comprehend, awaiting the fulfillment of promises written in the early pages of Genesis. As the blessing of Japheth unfolded across generations, the names of his sons Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meek, and Tus emerged not merely as entries in a genealogy, but as the roots of civilizations that would leave indelible marks on the world. Each name carried with it a legacy of movement, settlement, and influence, a thread in the intricate tapestry of history that would span continents and millennia. Gomer, often associated with the regions north of Israel, became the forebear of peoples whose migrations would ripple across Europe, laying early foundations for cultures that valued structure, order, and communal identity. Magog, whose identity has sparked both ancient curiosity and modern interpretation, became entwined with lands that would one day play pivotal roles in geopolitical shifts, standing as a reminder that the descendants of Japheth were destined to engage with history not passively but as shapers of it. Madai, linked to the ancient Persians, carried a name that would resonate through the courts and empires of antiquity, where governance, strategy, and law were not merely tools of control but instruments of civilization building, creating systems that allowed cities to flourish and knowledge to be preserved. Javan, the father of the Greeks, became the conduit through which philosophy, art, and the pursuit of reason would spread, seeding schools of thought that challenge humanity to examine existence, morality, and the cosmos itself. Through the Greek world, the descendants of Japheth laid intellectual frameworks that would later serve as the lens through which the message of the gospel could be understood and articulated, demonstrating that culture and faith often advance hand in hand when societies are prepared thoughtfully and intentionally. Tubal and Meek, situated near the Black Sea and the Caucasus, contributed to the development of regions that became crossroads of commerce and exchange, where ideas, languages, and traditions intersected and evolved. In these territories, roads were built not just for armies, but for merchants, travelers, and scholars, creating arteries through which the lifeblood of civilizations flowed. Tus, sometimes connected to southeastern Europe, added to the mosaic of people and places that collectively shaped trade, governance, and the early stirrings of regional identity. Each son of Japheth, while only briefly named in Scripture, became the progenitor of peoples whose movements and settlements would influence the contours of history, affecting language, law, governance, and philosophy in ways that could not have been predicted by mere observation of the genealogical lines. The impact of Japheth's descendants becomes even more remarkable when viewed through the lens of cultural preparation for the spiritual truths that would later traverse the world. as the Greeks formulated logic and categories of thought, as the Persians constructed administrative systems capable of managing vast territories, and as the Romans, emerging from these lines, developed law, infrastructure, and organization. The stage was being meticulously prepared for the spread of a message that transcended ethnic and geographic boundaries. Roads, cities, languages, and governance were not incidental. They were tools and instruments, laying the foundation upon which ideas could travel, communities could communicate, and faith could be shared across regions previously inaccessible. The civilizations founded by Japheth's sons created the intellectual and practical scaffolding that allowed the gospel to reach the farthest corners of the Mediterranean and beyond, demonstrating that expansion is not only territorial but cultural and spiritual in nature. Even as these nations rose and interacted with one another, the prophetic dimension of Japheth's lineage became increasingly evident. Names once confined to genealogies reappeared in visions, as in the prophetic writings of Ezekiel, where Magog and others are mentioned in the context of end-time events. This continuity illustrates that Japheth's descendants were not simply historical actors. They were participants in a divine narrative where the expansion of influence, the shaping of civilizations, and the interplay between peoples were orchestrated to fulfill purposes that bridged history and prophecy. Their contributions were multifaceted, encompassing intellectual, political, and spiritual dimensions, revealing a pattern where quiet beginnings could lead to transformative outcomes that extend far beyond the immediate context. The line of Japheth exemplifies a principle that transcends generations. Influence often manifests through preparation and provision rather than through direct spotlight or immediate recognition. These descendants built societies, systems, and networks that would carry ideas, values, and ultimately spiritual truths, proving that the work done in anticipation can be as powerful as the actions taken in direct response to events. They were architects of civilizations, carriers of knowledge, and silent facilitators of the conditions necessary for both cultural and spiritual expansion. In tracing the journeys of Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meek, and Tus, one sees a continuum where the seeds of faith, reason, governance, and civilization converge, illustrating that the promise of enlargement spoken over Japheth was not limited to land or wealth, but encompassed influence, understanding, and the power to shape the course of human history. Ultimately, the story of Japheth's sons is a testament to the hidden yet enduring impact of those whose contributions are often understated in the narrative of Scripture. While Shem's line carried the covenantal promise and Ham's line navigated its own challenges, Japheth's descendants quietly but profoundly shaped the material and intellectual world, creating the channels through which cultures could grow, ideas could spread, and faith could travel across continents and generations. In this intricate interplay of history, prophecy, and preparation, Japheth's sons become more than names. They are the architects of civilizations, the bearers of culture, and the unseen facilitators of a divine plan that would eventually touch every corner of the earth. Centuries passed, and the names of Japheth's descendants, once quietly etched into the genealogies of Genesis, began to emerge again in the pages of prophecy, reminding the world that history and destiny are intertwined and that blessings carry both opportunity and responsibility. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, the prophet speaks of Gog, the land of Magog, Tubal, and Meshech, names that trace directly back to Japheth's sons, evoking images of vast armies, geopolitical movements, and dramatic confrontations in the latter days. These verses are not merely tales of future conflict. They are profound statements about the enduring influence of Japheth's lineage, showing that the expansion promised by Noah was never only geographical or cultural, but also prophetic, bearing implications that would reach into the spiritual and moral fabric of history itself. The reappearance of these names in the context of end-time prophecy creates a tapestry where human action and divine orchestration intersect, revealing that the legacy of Japheth carries a weight far beyond what one might assume from a mere genealogy. His descendants, who had built civilizations, codified laws, spread languages, and cultivated philosophical inquiry, are now seen in a different light, where their inherited influence intersects with the unfolding drama of history in ways that are both cautionary and instructive. The armies of Magog and Tubal are symbolic not just of physical might but of the capacity for inherited influence to shape events, reminding humanity that the privileges of blessing are inseparable from the responsibility to act faithfully and wisely within the broader narrative of God's plan. Through these prophecies, one sees a striking pattern. Japheth's enlargement was not passive, and his dwelling in the tents of Shem was not guaranteed in perpetuity. Rather, both blessings and influence come with accountability, the same lines that carried wisdom, infrastructure, and civilization also carry the potential for rebellion, conflict, and misuse of power. This duality reflects a broader principle woven into Scripture, where human freedom interacts with divine design, allowing choices to either align with or oppose the unfolding of God's purposes. The names Tubal and Meshech in Ezekiel 38 are not arbitrary. They serve as markers of this continuity, illustrating that the descendants of Japheth are actors in a story that spans from Genesis to Revelation, from quiet beginnings to dramatic conclusions, from the building of roads and cities to armies assembled in the twilight of history. Yet, woven into the imagery of these chapters is also a reminder of divine sovereignty and ultimate resolution. While Japheth's descendants are associated with power, expansion, and even military might, the prophetic text consistently underscores that human action unfolds under divine oversight, that blessings are never detached from purpose, and that influence must ultimately be exercised in alignment with God's vision. The prophetic resurrection of these names functions as both warning and encouragement. The potential inherent in Japheth's line, cultivated over generations through culture, philosophy, governance, and infrastructure, is immense. But it must be directed toward fulfilling the covenantal purposes that extend through Shem and the spiritual inheritance of all nations. Ezekiel's vision also demonstrates the continuity of history in ways that are both awe-inspiring and sobering. The very nations and regions that emerged from Japheth's sons, which carried culture, learning, and influence into the classical and medieval worlds, are now envisioned in prophetic conflict, reminding us that history is not a linear accumulation of progress but a dynamic interplay of blessing, responsibility, and choice. The narrative draws a line from the subtle blessing over a seemingly quiet son of Noah to the dramatic movements of peoples and powers in the final chapters of human events, emphasizing that every generation inherits both gifts and obligations, that the capacity to influence history comes with the imperative to steward it wisely, and that the echoes of one family line can reverberate across millennia. Through this lens, the prophecy of Magog and his allies becomes more than an eschatological warning. It is a lens through which to view the enduring significance of Japheth's lineage, the same descendants who facilitated the spread of culture, law, and knowledge, who created frameworks that enabled philosophical and spiritual discourse, are now depicted as pivotal actors in the culmination of history, illustrating that influence is never neutral and that legacy is inseparable from moral and spiritual responsibility. The expansion promised to Japheth was as much about preparing the world for engagement with divine truth as it was about ensuring that the descendants of all nations would encounter the covenantal blessings promised through Shem. In reflecting upon these prophecies, one can see that the narrative arc of Japheth's descendants is both expansive and intricate. From quiet beginnings in the genealogy of Genesis to the civilizations of Greece, Persia, and Rome, from the cultural, philosophical, and political scaffolding they provided to the eventual unfolding of spiritual truths to the Gentiles, and finally to their reemergence in prophetic visions, the story reveals a divine design that marries human agency with divine orchestration. It illustrates that blessings are not static, they are dynamic, calling for the engagement of those who inherit them, and that influence carries an enduring responsibility to align with the moral and spiritual purposes for which it was granted. Ultimately, the presence of Japheth's names in end-time prophecies underscores a profound truth. The enlargement promised by Noah was never just about land or numbers. It was about shaping history and culture, preparing the world for covenantal inclusion, and demonstrating that every gift carries weight, purpose, and accountability. The legacy of Japheth is thus a continuous thread from Genesis through the unfolding of history into prophecy, illustrating that the forgotten son of Noah was, in fact, central to the shaping of civilizations, the spread of spiritual truth, and the orchestration of events that bridge the ancient and the eternal, reminding us that influence, like blessing, is inseparable from responsibility. As history unfolded, a remarkable interplay between the descendants of Shem and Japheth became increasingly evident, revealing a divine orchestration that bridged spiritual promise with cultural preparation. Where the line of Shem carried the seed of the Messiah, while Japheth's descendants labored quietly yet profoundly to shape the world in ways that would allow that promise to flourish. The Messiah, born through Shem's lineage, brought salvation and covenantal fulfillment. Yet the stage upon which this salvation would be proclaimed required careful preparation, a scaffolding of civilization, thought, and infrastructure that would enable the message to travel beyond the confines of a single nation or culture. Japheth's children became the architects of that stage, not by divine mandate alone, but through generations of cultural, intellectual, and political development that intertwined with the providential design woven into history. From the ancient Greeks, descendants of Javan, arose schools of philosophy and inquiry that cultivated reason, debate, and analytical thought, tools that would later prove indispensable in articulating the gospel in a manner that resonated across diverse audiences. Through logic, rhetoric, and philosophical inquiry, the Greeks created frameworks that allowed people to understand abstract truths and engage with ideas beyond mere tradition or local custom, preparing minds to receive spiritual truths that were universal in scope. Meanwhile, the descendants of Madai, the Persians, established empires characterized by administrative sophistication, law, and governance, creating structures capable of managing vast populations and territories. These systems of order and oversight were not merely practical. They were essential in forming societies where ideas could circulate, cities could prosper, and networks of communication could be established, allowing the message of the Messiah to move efficiently across regions previously isolated by geography or tribal divisions. The Romans, emerging from the lines of Tubal and Meek, took these foundations further, transforming roads, infrastructure, legal systems, and political organization into a platform for unprecedented expansion and connectivity. Through Roman roads, trade routes, and cities, The Mediterranean and surrounding regions were linked in a way that enabled communication, travel, and cultural exchange on a scale that had never been seen before. It was upon this network that the early followers of Christ could travel, preach, and establish communities, turning the very mechanisms of governance and infrastructure into instruments for the spread of faith. Japheth's descendants, often overlooked in biblical narrative, were thus quietly fulfilling a role that was both temporal and spiritual, shaping the material and intellectual conditions necessary for the gospel to reach a world beyond Israel. Even literacy and language, shaped by these civilizations, played a pivotal role in the preparation of the world. The spread of Greek as a lingua franca allowed the New Testament to be written in a language accessible to multiple cultures, bridging ethnic and geographical divides. Philosophical traditions cultivated critical thinking and discourse, creating audiences capable of understanding and wrestling with profound moral and spiritual truths. Legal codes and civic structures established stability and predictability, creating environments where communities could thrive, exchange ideas, and encounter transformative teachings. Every innovation, city, and institution built by Japheth's descendants became a conduit for the message carried by the line of Shem, illustrating a synergy between divine promise and human agency, where blessings unfold not only through inheritance but through preparation, stewardship, and engagement. The interplay of Japheth's cultural, intellectual, and political contributions with Shem's spiritual inheritance demonstrates a profound principle. Divine promises often require human preparation to be fully realized, and the impact of one lineage can complement the mission of another in ways that transcend immediate recognition or fame. Japheth's descendants laid foundations for civilizations capable of supporting widespread communication, education, governance, and cultural cohesion, all of which became instruments through which the message of Christ could be disseminated efficiently and enduringly. Their expansion, as prophesied by Noah, was not merely territorial, it was strategic, designed to cultivate environments where spiritual truths could find fertile ground and where faith could thrive across generations and nations. As the gospel spread from Jerusalem into the Mediterranean world, the foresight embedded in Japheth's blessing became evident. Churches were established in cities that had been strategically developed by his descendants. Letters and texts could travel across established roads. Ideas could be debated in public forums where philosophical traditions encouraged reflection and inquiry. And civic stability allowed communities to flourish and support enduring institutions of learning and worship. The cultural, intellectual, and political groundwork laid by Japheth's children was inseparable from the spiritual expansion that followed, proving that preparation and blessing, when aligned with purpose, can produce outcomes of monumental significance. This convergence of heritage and preparation, where Shem brought the Messiah and Japheth prepared the world, underscores the interconnectedness of history, prophecy, and divine design. The Messiah's work was made accessible and transformative not solely by miraculous power, but also through the careful shaping of societies, the creation of intellectual frameworks, and the establishment of systems capable of sustaining faith communities. The narrative of Japheth's descendants serves as a powerful reminder that influence is often exercised quietly, that preparation can be as critical as proclamation, and that the blessing of enlargement carries with it both opportunity and responsibility. Through culture, intellect, and governance, Japheth's line created the stage upon which the promise of Shem could be fulfilled, demonstrating that the unfolding of God's plan requires both visible and unseen labor, both spiritual inheritance and worldly preparation, culminating in the spread of the gospel to every nation and generation. As we draw this journey to a close, Japheth's story stands as a profound testament to the power of quiet influence and faithful service, showing us that impact does not require fame, spotlight, or recognition, but rather consistency, obedience, and alignment with a greater purpose. While his brothers, Shem, occupy more prominent positions in biblical narratives, Japheth's life and legacy remind us that God often works through the unseen, the overlooked, and the underestimated. From the brief mention in Genesis to the far-reaching civilizations of his descendants, Japheth's influence stretches across centuries, continents, and cultures, quietly shaping the conditions necessary for the fulfillment of divine promises, illustrating that true significance is measured not by human applause, but by enduring contribution to God's plan. Japheth's blessing. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, encapsulates a vision of purpose that transcends the ordinary markers of success. The promise of enlargement was not merely territorial or political, it was spiritual, cultural, and intellectual. His line became the conduits through which philosophy, law, infrastructure, language, and governance were refined, enabling the spread of the gospel beyond Israel to the Gentile world. In other words, Japheth's quiet obedience laid the groundwork for global transformation. This narrative teaches that sometimes the most influential roles are those played behind the scenes, in the shaping of environments, systems, and frameworks that allow the seeds of faith to flourish in ways that immediate recognition cannot measure. The story of Japheth also invites us to reflect on our own lives, asking us to consider how we can embrace purpose over recognition. Each act of integrity, patience, and faithful labor, no matter how small or unnoticed, contributes to a larger design, just as Japheth's descendants prepared the world culturally, intellectually, and politically for the arrival and spread of Christianity. Our daily actions can ripple far beyond what we see, touching lives and shaping circumstances in ways we may never fully realize. The hidden, faithful service of one individual can create a foundation upon which generations thrive, proving that God values not the noise we make but the fruit we bear. Moreover, Japheth's narrative carries a message about responsibility. To be enlarged is to be entrusted, and with influence comes accountability. His descendants were given the tools and opportunity to impact civilizations, and the choices they made determined whether that influence would build, nurture, and sustain, or whether it would be misused or lead to conflict. Likewise, for believers today, gifts, opportunities, and platforms are not merely privileges, they are responsibilities. Japheth's life encourages us to steward what we have been given wisely, recognizing that the invisible work done with faithfulness, patience, and integrity often holds more lasting weight than visible accolades or immediate success. The quiet nature of Japheth's impact also offers comfort and encouragement to those who feel overlooked or undervalued. In a world that often celebrates visibility, achievement, and recognition, it is easy to feel insignificant or unnoticed. Japheth's example reassures us that being out of the spotlight does not equate to being unimportant. God's purposes are not contingent upon human approval. They operate according to divine wisdom, timing, and design. The very fact that Japheth, the son who seems almost forgotten in Scripture, became the father of nations whose structures facilitated the spread of the gospel, illustrates that influence can be monumental even when unseen, and that faithfulness, not fame, is the ultimate measure of significance. Furthermore, Japheth's story bridges history, prophecy, and personal application, demonstrating that our lives are part of a larger narrative, The same line that quietly prepared civilizations also reappears in prophetic visions, reminding us that our actions have enduring implications beyond our immediate context. Each choice, each act of service, each commitment to integrity participates in a story that extends far beyond our own lifetimes. In this sense, Japheth's legacy is not merely historical, it is instructional, spiritual, and deeply personal, offering a model for how believers can live with purpose, cultivate influence, and remain faithful even in obscurity. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Japheth, let it inspire renewed perspective on how we view success, service, and significance. Let it challenge us to embrace our callings with diligence, to serve faithfully even when unseen, and to recognize that God's plan often operates through the quiet, patient, and persistent efforts of those willing to walk in obedience. Every effort, every act of love, wisdom, and integrity contributes to a broader tapestry of impact. Much like Japheth's descendants shaped civilizations and prepared the world for spiritual transformation. Thank you for joining this journey into the story of Japheth, the forgotten son of Noah, whose quiet obedience reshaped history in ways that continue to influence our world today. If this story stirred something in you, opened your eyes to the hidden power of faithful service, or encouraged you to embrace your own purpose, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can continue exploring the untold stories of Scripture, uncovering lessons for faith, life, and the impact of living faithfully in alignment with God's plan. Your engagement helps bring these stories to others who may be searching for understanding, encouragement, or inspiration. Remember, significance is not always loud, and purpose is not always visible, but as Japheth's legacy teaches us, the fruit of faithful service can resonate across generations, touching countless lives in ways we may never fully see. Subscribe, like, and share, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden power and enduring impact of those whom history almost forgot.